Okay, thank you everybody for joining. We'll be having more people join as the session goes on. Very excited to be taking part in this event. Just a quick note, as some of you may have seen from your Zoom link, your invitation that you'll have received, that we are doing a Q&A, and it will be open up to you as participants at the end after I've finished speaking to Sharon. And what I ask is that you put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box, so we can keep track of them. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. So I will start. So a huge welcome to Sharon Burrow. I'm very excited to be talking to you. Sharon is the first woman General Secretary of the ITUC. It's a massive achievement, a big milestone for all of us women in the movement. And she's basically the representative of workers across the world. So it's a huge honor and very, very exciting to be talking to Sharon today. Of course, because of Sharon's position, she has a unique view of how unions everywhere are responding to both the economic and health and safety crises that have been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we all know that this has been, a very difficult time for trade unions. Workers' jobs have been under threat and worker safety has been under threat. But also it's been quite an important time for trade unions as well, because after many years of being marginalised, suddenly unions find themselves sort of centre stage. There's been a surge in trade union membership as workers begin to realise that their jobs and safety are at stake. And, in the UK, where successive governments have demonised trade unions, now we find that they're working hand in hand. The TUC had a huge role in the furlough scheme introduced by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And trade unions have really been an essential part of planning the government's response to saving jobs and livelihood, which is a massive change. So I'm looking forward to listening to Sharon's reflections on this moment and what unions can do to build their membership and influence the way that the pandemic changes our lives as workers and as people. And just to remind you that ITUC represents 200 million workers from across 163 countries and territories, and it has 332 national affiliates. So this is very big conversation we'll be having. So thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us today. So I guess my first question is, please just tell us what your view of the lay of the land is. What are the main challenges facing trade union members and workers at the moment, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, good morning, and good morning to all the delegates. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and particularly on a topic that's so close to my heart as a union organiser. And I think we'll talk about that, but I started my union career as an organiser. But we are living through a period of global history with unprecedented solidarity. People have given up civic freedoms, risking livelihoods to save lives. And that's as it should be. But I want to first of all give a shout out to the frontline workers, the workers who've kept us safe in our hospitals, in care centres, the workers in supermarkets and broader retail, transport workers, service workers, all those people who've gone to work and risked their lives to actually make our lives possible to continue. So thank you. We really appreciate it. And it's worth noting, of course, everywhere that 60% of health workers are women, 56% of service workers are women, and they're amongst the low paid. And so coming out of this, there are many things we need to tackle, but certainly inequality is one of them. And we were already in a massive historical period of inequality. It was income inequality, and everybody knows the story of the 1% and a failed economic model. It was racial injustice and gender injustice. When you add that to the climate emergency that we know is about the very extinction of the human race, and we have no choice but now to both climate and employment proof our workplaces, kapow in union language, then we know that these things, combined with the facing the choice of the best and worst of technology, that unions were already fighting back. And then COVID-19 crashed in from left field to this age of anger and despair that workers were already struggling with, and their unions were at the centre of organising around the fight back to those struggles. And it's, of course, a massive health crisis, Ellie, but it's also now an economic and social crisis, and it's morphed into a human rights crisis, as many of our authoritarian governments use those far-right tactics of actually hiding behind the virus to attack labour rights, to destroy human rights, and we know that story very well. So unions, I'm very proud of the unions, can I just say, let me say this up front, they quickly pivoted to taking on the fight with governments, particularly around, you know, those vital areas of paid sick leave, of job and wage guarantees, of broader income support, because the global labour force is in trouble. 60% of our workers now work informally, whether they're in developing or developed economies. They're people who don't have a direct employment relationship. So wage support and income support were vital. Access to health, and then of course the very fights for fundamental safety and health at work, front and centre. So unions have done an amazing job. They've made huge advances on the social contract. We now need to keep them, and we need to build on that with recovery and resilience that actually sets us up against future global shocks. So organising is the only answer.
So on that, you started as an organiser in the 1970s. That's how you started your...
That's a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, especially because of everything that's happened. I mean, I feel like we've like lived through a decade in the past month. So what were the big challenges you faced when you were starting out, and what lessons do you think that you learned then that we can still that can still be carried through to today?
So I was a teacher and a union representative in the 70s, and I taught for almost more than a decade, and then I became a union organiser full-time in the 80s. And at those times, I had a country organising route. These were the luxurious days of a workforce that was basically in designated spots where you could go visit your members in a workplace. You could organise meetings of the local chapter after school or at night. And indeed, the struggles then were all about those teachers wanting to do their jobs more effectively. So the fights for reducing class sizes, the fights for proper professional development, for training, for proper wages, of course, always on the agenda, collective bargaining at the core of both those social issues as well as the professional and wage issues. But what I learned is that I had to know what it was that people were really worried about before we could build campaigns that usually had a common thread. And so whatever the big issue of the day was, but it also had personal stories. So I learned very quickly that the power is with the workers, and it's in the workplace. And if you want to bring people together around a campaign, and you have a very defined, clear win. What do you want to win? Because that's built on people's experience and their demands, then telling their stories, putting them up front to tell the stories of what they want, making people really feel the power of solidarity. So as an organizer, I learned that I may have brilliant ideas, but frankly, if they weren't making connections, and if our leadership at the time and their policy priorities weren't making connections with the needs of the workers, we were not going to win. So it's all about the power of workers and making sure we build that common sense of determination to win, whatever the issue is, and the solidarity that brings us the collective power.
So what are the most impressive examples of that you've seen during the pandemic, do you think, from unions and organisers?
Well, as I said, unions have made amazing advances on the social contract in many, many countries. But some of the stories that I love are where they've responded again to the individual. So if you go to the Malaysian trade unions, they set up a hotline for impacted workers. They actually had 8 of their industrial officers listening to those complaints on the hotline, and every night they were sent to organisers so they could follow up organising opportunities, help resolve the issues. And the great news is that, of course, they had to use phone and WhatsApp because everyone was locked down, and they established in just that time 4 new unions with around 4,000 members on which they can now build. That's in Asia. If you go to I just picked out a few from around the world. There are many, but go to the Dominican Republic, then call center workers. These are workers that everybody says it's too hard to organize, remote work. Well, they negotiated to work from home. They have the company pay for the internet in their homes, and they've agreed to flexible hours because call center operators didn't want to stop their services. In fact, in some areas they were vital. But these workers fought on a health and safety basis and have won new conditions through the lockdown. And then, can I just go back to one that's in Asia, because it's the region I come from, and it's a country I love dearly, of course, and that's New Zealand. It's not my own. I love that dearly too, but we're very close to the New Zealanders. And I love this story because this company is it makes plastics, storage containers. And that company convinced governments that they were essential and had to stay open. So the workers were forced to work. Well, the workers did what unions do. They had a meeting. They actually had their unions advise them that, in fact, they had every right to demand that they didn't feel that this workplace was around safety or health. So they just stopped work. After 20 minutes, suddenly, and they were all maintaining social distance. It was beautiful to watch. They actually, 20 minutes is all it took for the management to sit down and talk to them. The management agreed that they would get, protective equipment, and they'd put in place social measures, but they also agreed to a review of whether it was an essential business. And until that was decided, workers were sent home on full pay. Indeed, in the end, the great story is it was decided it wasn't essential, but the unions kept the full pay. So those stories are writ large around the world, and I know there's some already on the work side. But every union has looked at what it can do, either to respond to workers or to make sure that workers were able to contact them. And there are really inspirational stories, and unions in some areas are growing. There's no doubt about that. They're not necessarily at the moment because of the situation being paid fees. For example, if you go to a union like Fiji, they actually went to the villages and talked to the leaders, and they re-signed up all their workers in tourism and those other hard, vitally impacted sectors, but without fees. But that's the way we start to build unions, actually making people feel that someone has their back.
I'm just going to pause just quickly as the sign language interpreters just switch over. Thank you very much, Louise. Now Sandy's starting, so we can start again. First of all, I should mention something I didn't say at the start, which is this event is being recorded by the ITUC and may be on YouTube. And the reason that I mention this now is because I'm delighted about that, because those are such great examples. I'm glad that they'll be captured because they're very inspiring for us to hear about. So we're living in an era of crisis at the moment. Lots of crises have, sort of hit our politics and our economics over the last decade or so. And I'd like to talk more about, what lessons we learned from those. And what do you think that the unions learned from the financial crisis in 2008?
So there are many things we learned from the financial crisis in 2008, but if I can just paint a slightly longer picture of history, our international institutions were born out of crisis. You know, 2 world wars and a Great Depression. The ILO established to build the global rule of law, fundamental labour rights, minimum wage standards, collective bargaining rights. All of those things were built out of post-World War I. 2019, the ILO was born, and it was a unique tripartite body, which we still fight for social dialogue. Why? Because it works. When you negotiate agreements with governments, employers and unions, or when you're negotiating a collective agreement as the result of an organising campaign in a workplace, then you have the strength of both the power of workers on an issue, but also the, you know, the capacity to negotiate a better deal. So then after 2 world wars and the Great Depression, then in fact the Philadelphia Declaration gave us a reaffirmation that social peace and stability was fundamental to a social contract. So again, things like the living wage that the UK members and many of us around the world have fought for was actually central to the Philadelphia Declaration, along with those fundamental rights. And now, of course, we're fighting for occupational health and safety to be a fundamental right. And last year, in that convergence of crisis, we negotiated the ILO Centenary Declaration. And it actually has a lot of the answers. How do we put a labour protection floor under all workers, you know, irregardless of the employment relationship? How do we guarantee universal social protection? How do we actually guarantee a transformative agenda for women and just transitions for climate and technology? And how do we make sure that public services and reform of the global model of economy and trade and those things are on the agenda? Taxation, of course, being central to that. But then in the 80s, you know, why did we have to negotiate those things or renegotiate those things last year? Why are we now fighting for implementation? Well, in the 80s, we saw hyper-globalization, and it gave birth to those dehumanizing, exploitative supply chains on which that inequality, you know, the lack of shared profits and productivity was born. And so that broke down the social contract, just smashed it to smithereens. And the wage share since, you know, that time has just gone like that, like a curve that's just like a ski slope. And so when we got to 2008, 2009, we already had a social contract that was just hanging on by its threads. We'd already seen the explosion of a shift in the business model where businesses weren't registered, regulated, businesses were avoiding tax, a whole range of those issues that we're still dealing with now. And we, of course, as we just have said, 2% spending, seems like such a little amount now, 2% of expenditure would actually stabilise the global economy, save jobs, and we supported it 100%. We even negotiated what those resilience packages looked like in many countries. But then in 2000, I remember as Francis and others will, certainly Brendan was at the table in London when we negotiated with Gordon Brown around jobs being at the centre of the recovery and green jobs, even in that context. But of course, in 2010, Europe gave rise to austerity. And what we learned out of that is you cannot make these demands without conditionality. And I know particularly that Francis and other leaders are thinking about what the conditionality on business must be. So that's the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned as we build recovery plans, they must have a resilience. They must not leave us with no resilience for the next global shock, because it will come, be from climate, or it'll be from another pandemic, or it'll be an economic disaster. And so we know that this time we have to have a very different approach. Of course, jobs have to be at the centre. Of course, we have to have the transition to a sustainable economy, but we must also have longer term or patient investment, as we call it. And indeed, this time, patient debt. Because what really worked, what didn't work last time for workers was they paid 3 times. Their jobs are affected. And then, of course, they paid with taxpayers' money to stabilise the economy. And then when austerity was born, they actually paid with a tax on their wages and their social protection. And that was because the marriage of the bond markets and the ratings agencies was just evil. It actually meant that speculative capital won, that whole economies went into recession, and the rest is history. So this time with recovery, and we know all the elements we want in recovery around workers and rights and protection and inclusion, but we also need to make sure that the way we finance and the way we recover debt over a longer period of time based on genuine stability and capacity to pay back has to shift.
What is it about this crisis in particular that you think has really made unions so much more prominent in public life and in the public eye?
Well, because unions were out on the front line fighting. As soon as and that's why I say I'm very proud of the union movement. As soon as the crisis hit, you know, we all went into overdrive, but I saw unions all around the world simply make a set of demands, and they were those fundamental demands that protected people. So again, paid sick leave, job guarantees, wage guarantees, income support, access to health in many countries. There had to be a broadened access to health. We take it for granted in many countries that health is universal. Not so in too many nations. And of course, we've been fighting right alongside those unions for universal social protection. If I told you that while we know 300 million jobs are at risk in the formal sector, there's actually 1.6 billion of our brothers and sisters in the informal economies around the world, many of them in our developed economies, facing destitution right now, because unless you have universal social protection, then these people get left out. So we've been fighting for, and this is now being picked up in many countries where unions are starting to organise around social protection, as well as wages and other vital areas that are fundamental to survival. But we are fighting for a global protection fund for the poorest of nations. And I can tell you, in a $10 trillion spend, more or less now, it'll probably be double that by the time we see a hope of recovery. Then we're only asking for around $35 billion for 5 years to give some of those 1.6 billion a guarantee of income support and access to health. It's really tough to get governments in the face of multilateralism that's in crisis to raise their head and give that global solidarity. I'm confident we'll win it. We have governments on our side, we have institutions, but it is shocking to see that this time around we're still excluding people, and they're the poorest of our brothers and sisters. So we have a lot of organising challenges, but I think bringing it back to home, if workers are feeling really frightened, they're losing their jobs, they're losing their income, and the unions out in the front lines, as you've seen in the UK and many, many countries. Let me tell you a story from my own country about MIA, the Arts and Entertainment Alliance. You know that our equity unions have actually got some of the answers because they've fought for a minimum contract price, which is a minimum income. And when, of course, in many countries, they were excluded from the, whatever you call them, job seeker, job guarantee schemes, then this Australian union actually immediately suspended dues payments. But it ran a campaign alongside of it to fight to get those workers included, to get those guarantees. And less than 15% of the members took up the due, even though they had no income, took up the dues reduction, and they grew. So, you know, responding immediately where unions are on the front lines, either in the public eye, married with being there and available for the concerns of workers on the ground, plus these sorts of examples where you have that personal contact, then that works. People say, well, the unions have my back, I want to be part of that tribe. And that's what organising is.
So all of us listening to you now, all of the participants who we have with us will know that part and part and parcel of being in our movement means facing opposition from people who want to stop us from being successful. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what kind of threats that we might face going forward, and what organisers can do about those threats.
So I'm not sure the threats are new, but they're certainly going to be very, very deep in many areas. If you think of it from the top level of a human rights crisis, then already you have governments around the world, Brazil, India, the Philippines, Hong Kong, you know, Zimbabwe, you know, covering the continents, but there are many, many more, where unions are fighting for fundamental rights to freedom of association, to organise. The anti-terror laws in the Philippines are really aimed at stopping activism, whether it's human rights defenders, labour rights defenders, environmental defenders, but our union's already on the line in a country that already red tags union leaders. I worry for their safety. Hong Kong fighting for democracy, That means something very special to UK brothers and sisters, because of course it was, you know, a UK territory for so long. And of course you've got then, you know, the sheer audacity of the Brazilian government. I think it's an irony that Bolsonaro actually denied that the virus was anything more than a flu, and now he has it himself. But nevertheless, you know, these are authoritarian or worse, you know, governments. And fascism, even across Europe, it's just there. So we have to find the answers, and they are about organising, to have people's views written into a narrative that gives people confidence that we can fight for our democracies, for a new social contract, and we can meet the test of the fight against climate. They're our three front lines. But when you think about the employer side of it, we have two employer communities. One actually knows they have to change, and I've seen some very hopeful charters negotiated with unions around what companies will commit to, including living wages, health and safety, you know, due diligence, working with unions. But we also have to tackle this on two other fronts. And again, I come back to the conditionality of companies that I've been talking to with Francis and others. Some nations have already put conditionality. If we're going to, you know, help companies, and of course that has to be not just business continuity, but wage, job protection and wage guarantees. If public money is going to bail out these industries, then we want to know they're not using tax havens, they're not engaging in share buybacks. How insidious is it that some companies have taken money from governments, sacked workers, and then engaged in buying back their own shares? That is just something that should be criminal. But then beyond that, we want a commitment to rights and due diligence. In fact, we want mandated due diligence. And that isn't just about risk of assessment of human rights abuse. It's how we then organise around grievance procedures that must be in place to effect remedy, because we have to change the world. So knowing that we have to create a level playing field, organising around things like taxation, for example, and fair taxation. We already have some unfinished business in terms of companies paying tax where they earn it, closing down tax havens, the financial transactions tax around speculative, the speculative capital. But now we need a digital tax, because we've got the big tech companies, and we're engaged, of course, in a campaign to break up Amazon with some of your unions, the GMB, Unite, and the TUC, but also UNI as the Global Union of Services. It's a target because it's a symbol of the monopoly power that's growing there. They pay no tax in many areas. They treat workers as if they don't have rights. They sack them when they organise. So we've got a lot of work to do to rebuild a fair competition floor, but it has to have rights, both workers' rights and environmental standards, and at its core, freedom of association and the right to organise and collectively bargain. So we want those conditions. And right now, Europe's giving us some hope on a whole range of fronts. because they're talking about a directive for a minimum wage. They're talking about mandating due diligence. Their recovery packages has elements of that patient debt. In fact, their recovery package is built on social pillar of rights, on the Green Deal, and on just transitions. We want those guarantees everywhere. And there's another issue that we are talking about. It's got some issues for conservative government territory. But why, if we're spending public money, wouldn't we organise around actually governments taking equity in those companies, workers on boards? Let's actually look at how we socialise some of the gains in this period, maintain the social contract advances, and look to build the resilience, because we're genuinely involved in dialogue and shaping our future. That will take a massive organising and policy frame married together.
The sign language interpreters again are just going to switch over quickly.
Am I talking too quickly?
So we're on our final question now. You want to talk into quick? Did you say, sorry, did you have something to add then?
No, I said, am I speaking too quickly for the interpreters? Sorry.
Louise, are you? No, all good. Thank you, Sandy, for interpreting. So that was perfect timing, because I'm going to ask my final question now before we open it out to the Q&A. And my final question is, of course, circumstances differ from country to country for unions and for their organisers, but of course we also have a lot in common. So what would be the fundamental message that you would want all organisers across the world to take with them?
You know, it's easy for me. It's organise, organise, organise. We have to use this period. And in fact, I'm proud of my own global organising team, and I know the efforts in the UK, in many, many nations around the world, who are pivoting to look at how they use technology for our advantage. And it allows us to focus very clearly on the workplace, on the national affiliates, and supporting them around organising campaigns. You know, you have to have the power of workers before you can win anything. It's an inside or outsider strategy. We're all about collective bargaining, because that's the way we make advances. That's the social contract that we advance for workers. But you will never win effectively and sustain those victories if we don't have the vigilance and the resilience of workers' power. So that doesn't differ from country to country. Yes, the issues will differ, absolutely. We have to build floors in many areas of the world because they don't have social protection or minimum wages, as well as trying to look to advance collective bargaining. In many countries, we're fighting just for the right to freedom of association so workers won't be incarcerated or shot. You know, our recent Global Rights Index will tell you that justice is denied in 73% of countries for some workers, that more than 80% of countries have violated the right to strike, and more than 80% also freedom of association. So, you know, the unions are up against it, but that's why we have unions. Unions have always been the antidote to crisis, and that won't change. But it will take us as unions recommitting to organising. And when I watch our team with Corrine Walton and others training workers how to use programs like Zoom to have virtual online training and organising rooms with all of the activity that they've managed to create, then it makes my heart sing, because that allows us to do what you have to do. Identify workers who are leads, train people to have the one-on-one conversations, marry online and offline organising. We can do it. We just have to invest in organising like we never have before, so that we have the power going into those negotiations for our leaders to negotiate what workers know they want. And it will be around those areas that we laid out right at the beginning, where there's injustice and inequality and racial injustice or gender injustice, or where indeed we need to make workplaces safe. those things resonate with people, and that's what democracy and building a just future is all about.
So now we're going to open it out to the participants, and I've been seeing lots of people have been introducing themselves in the chat box, so I know that there's lots of brothers and sisters with us who have lots of Organise experience and knowledge, and I'm really happy to say that the questions that we've got so far are really great. So thank you very much. So I'm going to open with a really great question from Polly, who says, what piece of advice would you give to a female representative wanting to move into a trade union organising position within the movement? And just to say before you answer, I'm going to step off screen and just for a second, I'll be able to hear you because I have a shoulder injury, so I just need to stretch quickly. I'll be right back. Oh. It's a workplace sustained injury.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Sharon,
didn't
you can go. I can hear you.
So can you repeat the question?
Yes, sure. Sorry. What piece of advice would you give to a female representative wanting to move into a trade union organising position within the movement?
Ah, that's a great question. Just do it. You know, the first thing we have to learn as women, in my view, probably, you know, men as well, but as women, is you don't need a title to do a job, to assume power. If you're working in a workplace, organise your colleagues and build the campaigns, and pretty soon you'll get the kind of reputation that will get you jobs everywhere, because organisers are at the centre of our movement. In my view, I might be biased, and I might now be a trade union leader. I never meant to be. Organising was actually the best job I've ever held. I love teaching. I love the joy of teaching, but organising people was a dream job. It had everything you would want in terms of, you know, the humanity that you could support, in terms of ambition and dreams and justice. And that you are still really important, whether you're a workplace organiser, whether you're a formal trade union organiser, but start where you are and pretty soon the world's yours.
We have a question from Bora, and I'm going to combine this with another question from Askar. The question is, across the world, especially in developing countries, trade unionists face persecution, prosecution, jail time, torture and death. Do you think as trade unions we do enough to show solidarity with those comrades and support them? And I'll ask you, Sharon, also if you could think specifically about Iran, because the other question that we were asked is about what the trade unions are doing to support persecuted activists in Iran.
So the first question is, you've got to be proud of the global solidarity. There wouldn't be an ITUC if people didn't care about each other. Yes, it opens doors to some of our multilateral institutions. Yes, we can get access to a whole range of global leaders to paint a perspective around what workers want and need. But in the end, at its core, is the capacity to drive solidarity. And there are so many stories about unionists who've been jailed, that have been freed. One that comes to mind most recently is Japhet Mayo from Zimbabwe, where people just went in to actually make sure that he was freed, or, you know, support for our very own leader in Hong Kong, Lee Shuk-young. You know, I see that every day. We have a whole department dedicated to creating friends of various countries where workers are being persecuted. However, we always need to do more. We always need to do more. And it got harder as we've seen governments splinter and, you know, the power of governments acting coherently to defend, you know, human and labour rights actually break down. And that has to be rebuilt. But I guess, you know, when you come to Iran, it's a very difficult environment. You know, many of our very brave trade union activists can't actually be identified because they will be persecuted and put in jail. But the ITF and the EI and have affiliates in Iran, and they are very brave union leaders, and we are constantly backing them in terms of supporting workers who are persecuted. Is it enough? No, we need to see democratic forces in Iran, and we need to use the ILO and every other institution where freedom of association is possible. So we have a road to go, but in all of these countries, there are really brave men and women standing up for freedom, for democratic rights and freedoms, and they deserve our support.
Thank you. So we have a question from Rhiannon, who says, you mentioned that approximately 60% of workers are not employed formally. I was wondering if you'd be able to expand on that, i.e. are you talking more about casual work, 0 hours contracts, or something more broad than that?
So we're talking more broadly than that. So let's start with the 40%, because what I didn't say earlier is that even in those 40% who have a direct employment relationship, whether it's casuals work or the insidious 0 hours contract, you know, that's a fight about precarity, about precarious work, and how we secure the employment relationship on a much more stable basis. And again, there's some of the advances we have to make in the social contract as we rebuild it. In the informal work, it's a sector of desperation. There's no minimum wage, no rights, no rule of law, no social protection. And yet these workers work every day. But if they don't actually earn a daily income, they have nothing. Let me tell you about Jamal, who's a Somalian woman. And very early on the onset of COVID-19, she spoke to me about her situation. I wish I could show you a photo, but she's, you know, this incredibly strong young woman who runs a tea stand. She supports 7 members of her family. She goes every day and sets up the tea stand. And there was one of the very early days where she didn't even take a shilling home to feed 7 mouths and her own. That's why we're fighting for universal social protection for those countries.
We have a question from Tony Burke at Unite, one of my former colleagues. He says, we are seeing more trade deals across the globe, and many agreements do not have labour chapters. What can or is the ITUC doing to ensure that there are labour clauses in trade agreements that provide at least a safety net for workers?
So unions are fighting this everywhere. You know, no one believed us when you saw in the 80s and particularly the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, when unions were really fighting some of the most insidious aspects of trade, that was married with both those dehumanizing, exploitative supply chains I talked about. And I've walked those supply chains, and let me tell you, they are not workplaces you would ever want to have yourselves or your families involved in. And our solidarity there is absolute. In fact, a great story, if I can tell you this one, is even as we've been working with some of the better textile brands with Industrial, the industrial union internationally, to set up some rescue missions almost, to get money in to save jobs and to create social protection. You know, the workers in Myanmar, now, those of you who've been campaigners against the regime in Burma, like many of us for more than 30 years now, then you will be very proud to know, even before we could get that job done globally, the unions in Myanmar had actually had negotiated with the government and with the textile companies a deal that actually was then able to be used by the government to get money from support from the Asian Development Bank. So even as we saw those supply chains collapse, those kind of issues were going on. But, you know, we need to simply reform international trade, lock, stock and barrel. So let me explain that if I've got a minute. The WTO is on the verge of collapse. Now, I don't care whether we reform it or whether it collapses and we rebuild something else. This institution set up to actually stabilize trade. And if you go back to some of the original discussions, for those history buffs amongst you, read the Havana Charter. It was a very different beast that was organized, was envisaged than the one that was born with the WTO, which in large part has simply facilitated dominant country and company ambitions. So we need to see a very different WTO. It needs to, first of all, have a floor, which is, labour rights, environmental standards, human rights, absolutely guaranteed. And mandated due diligence has to be part of the way in which we protect that floor. But we need social partners. Why not? This is about work. It's about the real economy. Why wouldn't you have social partners like you have at the ILO, the OECD, the European Union, actually to have an advisory role in terms of what global trade looks like? And we need dispute mechanisms that are very different. Why wouldn't we be able to take, complaints against governments or companies to have them resolved where abuse of labour rights is the basis of trading arrangements? And then, of course, there's the trade deals themselves, which we have to fight for those clauses, but also for dispute and compliance mechanisms, because state-to-state disputes have let us down, frankly. They take a long time to arbitrate, and often, I think it took like 7 years for Guatemala, and it was just appalling when we saw the outcome. But we also have to recognise that we're moving into a very different world, and this is then going to take organising, because countries and workers want to reshore with technology and for resilience some of the supply chains that they saw were in fact impossible to access with the hit of the virus, particularly medical products, protective equipment and so on. But there'll be others, food security and many others. How do we then look towards what a model of global economy is in terms of a fair shares approach, where we don't see developing countries devastated? So it will take a lot of work and a lot of solidarity, but the global model of trade, the global model of economy has to be fundamentally reformed, and the power of workers is absolutely fundamental to that. That's why we have to organise to grow everywhere.
I'm just going to pause while Sandy and Louise switch over again. Thank you very much, Louise. Okay, we're ready.
I've actually lost voice.
Ellie, that's
sorry,
it.
Sorry.
I can hear now. Yeah.
Sorry. So the next question is from Michelle and Gemma, who have a very similar question. So I'm going to try and combine it into one question. And just to mention that always at these events, I try to alternate between men and women. So I ask one question from a man and one question from a woman. And I've run out of women. So if you're a woman and in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, I really like to encourage you to do that while Sharon is speaking just now, because I will take it and put it to her. And the questions have all been great so far, so please do. So the question from Michelle and Gemma is that there is a lot of hope internationally at the moment because of, in terms of young people, that they are dissatisfied with governments, they're worried about the climate, they're kind of rising up. What can trade unionists across the world do to educate young people about trade unionism and encourage them to join forces with our movement?
So if you go back to that area of convergence of crisis, it was already creating despair and anger. We've seen in our own global polling and our research and our rights index that we described it as we were already living through an age of anger, and it was grown out of fear and despair, and actually a real lack of trust, a breakdown in trust in our democracies. And young people have been on the streets around climate, as you said. We saw those magnificent Black Lives marches in solidarity, but also raising issues of racism and racial injustice in our own countries. In my country, it manifests particularly around just unconscionable rates of incarceration of our Indigenous people. And so, we are very proud of that activism, but we have to now find ways to engage people. And again, I come back to, we need social movements and allies, and of course that's part of our DNA, but I come back to focusing on the workplace. If we have the conversations in the workplace, like how do you climate and employment proof our workplaces, as we did a couple of weeks ago all around the world, magnificent conversations where workers were talking to themselves and their employers where they could. But we also need to have that about, you know, eliminating violence against women, but everybody in the workplace. And the amazing convention we negotiated last year, Convention 190, on eliminating violence in the workplace, is one of the tools we have now in order to have those conversations. How do you change your workplaces? How do you eliminate racism? How do you eliminate sexism? And how do you prevent violence, you know, erupting in any way related to work? But again, it comes back to organising. Young people know how to organise. So we have to give them a capacity to organise in their workplaces, in the community, and to be connected with us. And there are many good examples around the world of that. But we also need to think about how, if those workers, young workers, don't have jobs, how they can formally join a labour movement with the economic circumstances in which they find themselves. And that's a challenge because, you know, unions have been, you know, a committed club of workers who are activists, and they pay dues to actually keep their organising capacity running. But we have to have a broad church of thinking about how you can actually be part of a much broader labour movement if we're going to build the kind of community power as well as workplace power that will change the world. It's that simple.
So again, I'm going to, this might be our final question. I hope I can squeeze one more in, but let's see how we go. I'm going to combine this question because it's been asked in sort of variations from several people, which basically the question is that we're in big trouble in terms of the climate, and we know we need to do something about that. And what are unions doing across the world to address the climate crisis, and and what are some examples of a just transition? And that question isn't from any one particular person because it's been asked by a few people.
Well, this is an area I'm very proud of. We need to scale it up dramatically, but the trade union movement nationally and internationally fought for more than a decade, almost 15 years now, to get just transition in the Paris Climate Agreement. And we did that because we've been through many transitions, industrial transitions, social transitions. We've seen communities devastated and left behind. And this one, we know we have to face it, but we were determined it would be with greater justice, and that the dialogue base of workers having a voice about the future and how to make that transition, how to secure jobs, was fundamental. So arising from the Paris Climate Agreement, unions then went to work. We went to work. We built the Global Just Transition Centre, and it has great stories, whether it's from community organising around transition and supporting jobs in communities, through to national agreements around exit from coal and other fossil fuels so that no workers left behind, no community is left behind, wherever we can be involved, through to the transition we have to make in sectors. So, you know, in Sweden, we've started a conversation around steel and how it's possible. The technology can get us clean steel. Cement, clean cement. There's a company in India, and the unions are involved, that are actually not just talking about, and they've already done it, how you reduce emissions in cement, but how you build circularity into the cement processes. So what do you use the waste for? And it's really exciting work because unions know their workplace. They know so much about their industries that when they're at the table negotiating both for justice for themselves and their communities, but also about how you transition those companies to keep jobs in a net zero economy, I will back workers in every time to have so many ideas that we can climate and employment proof our workplaces. This is a huge area of work. We need to scale it up with the COP in Britain next year. We need those ambitious national development plans that are accompanying the so-called NDCs, or what governments will commit. They must be ambitious. They must be based on just transition in the agreements, and they must have dialogue tables with workers and their unions everywhere.
Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but those are really excellent questions, and unfortunately there were some really great questions that I didn't get time to ask. So thank you so much to all of the participants for really engaging so well in this event, and thank you of course to Sharon for all of your incredible expertise, your international expertise, just phenomenal listening to you. And of course, thank you to Sandy and Louise for your interpreting, and to all of the people at TUC who did all the tech stuff that I have no idea how to work, so thank you very much. So I think what we've learned from this event is that there are a lot of challenges facing the union movement at the moment, but we're also in a kind of unprecedented time, in the sense that people are really around the world understanding the importance of collectivism and coming together of their own volition, and they're recognizing that when their jobs are under threat and when their health is under threat, it's the union movement that will protect them. So this is a crisis, but it is also a huge moment for the unions. It's also an opportunity to build our movement, to protect working people, and also to change society for the better. So thank you so much to Sharon for your inspiration. Thank you everybody joining in for all of the incredible work that you do in your workplaces and your communities, and solidarity. I'm sure you'll do great things. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the TUC for great leadership in this crisis, and the unions, of course. Solidarity from me.